It is my real privilege to introduce this session and to introduce our two speakers today. I'm going to start with Christy. Christy Pichichero is Associate Professor of French and History in George Mason University. She received her PhD from Stanford, where her very decorated research led to her first book, The Military Enlightenment, War and Culture in the French Empire from Louis XIV to Napoleon. And that came out in 2017 and has recently been reissued in paperback. To much acclaim. She's speaking today, and she has published numerous articles, and you can look them up and read them, and has many, I think, forthcoming and in the pipeline from this new project. So she's speaking today on work drawn from a new project on the which examines intersectionality and processes of racialization in 18th century France. And our second speaker, Julie Duprat, is a conservator and historian, currently working at the Bibliothèque Historique de la Ville de France de Paris. She received her PhD from the École Nationale de Chartres, working on Black history in Bordeaux and France in the 18th and early 19th century. And her eagerly awaited new book just appeared a few weeks ago with Mola. And I apologize to the French historians in the room for what I'm about to do, but it is titled Bordeaux Métis, Esclaves et Affranchis de colère du 18e siècle à l'Empire. I'm sorry, German historian, but I will be looking forward to both of these two papers. So I think we actually, because Julie has only just joined us, not discussed who's going to speak first, but I'm going to call on Christy to speak first, if that's okay, since we know her PowerPoint works. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, perfect. Hear me?
Julie, yes, I do hear you.
Yes, so we can't see you. Can you see her?
Okay. It's so, everything is so slow, but yeah, I'm here, and I think you are going to see me in a few minutes now. Okay, yeah.
Great. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and share my screen then. Okay, can you all see that? Great. So many thanks first to the IHR seminar in European history, 1500 to 1800, to all of the co-conveners, and especially to Drs. Lisbeth Correns and Hannah Murphy, as well as my thanks to my co-presenter, Julie Duprat, for this fantastic opportunity to engage with you all in a conversation about Black lives in 18th century France and the French Empire. I want to thank you all for being here this evening. It is truly an honor for me and a pleasure to be here with you and to have this chance to share some of my thinking regarding what I, along with my colleagues at the Harvard Humanities Center, where I spoke just last month, what we're calling the critical 18th century study. So I've given a title to this talk, Talking Black and Back, Theorizing Race and Its Intersections in Critical 18th Century Studies. My talk today will give you a sense of what I mean by critical 18th century studies as I sketch some of the intellectual stakes and methods of my current project, burgeoning at the intersection of critical theory, gender studies, African diasporic studies, and Black European studies. So here we go, or not. Yes. His name was Jean Idon, or maybe it was Jean Idon. It may also have been David Idon, or Jean d'Apidon, or Jean Idion. Most likely, it was none of these. In contrast to most Black men in metropolitan France during the 18th century, his existence under these varied names is marked in 5 archival entries in the Service Historique de la Défense, the War Archive, in the Archives Nationales, the National Archives, and in an Archive Départementale, a regional archive. The military, where he served as a timbalier or drummer beginning in 1743, made him, or rather a heavily mediated fragment of him, visible. Idon enters the record in 1749, having been recruited by the famed Marshal Maurice de Saxe to serve in his pet regiment, the Volontaires de Saxe. Levied during the War of Austrian Succession of 1740 to 1748, the unit was largely composed of Eastern Europeans, Poles and Tartars, except for its first company of Black Uhlans, or light cavalry, from France's Caribbean colonies, as well as from Africa, Asia, and South America. Saxe took great and deliberate pains to assemble this company once the king authorized its creation on March 15th, 1743. He recruited them from other units in the French army, many of which had a single black timbalier who played drums to control the movement of troops. He had members of his entourage inquire about the whereabouts of these black soldiers, corresponded with their commanding officers, and offered handsome payoffs in order to acquire each soldier. He also took initiatives to get freemen or slaves who were from the colonies, but who were either living or temporarily located in France. In one instance, he was able to enlist 2 black enslaved men located in the Atlantic hub of Bordeaux, the specialty of Julie Duprat, since they had not been registered properly, which nullified the ownership status of their masters. Saxe's volontaire and his recruitment methods attracted the attention and the ire of colonial lobbyists, who were already present, active, and powerful in the 1740s. These individuals were horrified that Saxe would willfully steal their property, and were even more so at the thought that their former slaves would receive military training, that they might one day decide to turn against their former masters. They put tremendous pressure on the naval minister, the Comte de Maurepas, to intercede on their behalf and to curtail Saxe's mustering efforts, which Maurepas did. Of the 90 men in Saxe's Black Company, 39 came from the African continent, like Jean Itong, according to their places of origin listed in the Contrôle de Troupes, which are these registers, tabulated registers of all of the troops. Yet records indicate that Itong's background distinguished him from his comrades. In 1777, he is listed as having been born a prince in the kingdom of Juda or Ouida. Itong left me curious, and I admit rather skeptical, when I encountered his profile while researching my first book, The Military Enlightenment, War and Culture in the French Empire from Louis XIV to Napoleon. How on earth did a prince of Juda or Ouida end up serving in the French army? Skepticism was indeed merited. As Miranda Spieler has shown, the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763 was responsible for generating a new type of freedom story, emphasis on the word story, by which Black men were able to legally secure their free status in the metropole. Whether they had been formerly enslaved or not, Black men could obtain a billet de liberté, a billet of liberty or freedom, issued by the Paris Admiralty Court by proffering a simple autobiography that attested to their having been born free or having earned emancipation via military service. Spieler indicates that a number of men utilized this tactic in a calculated, though sometimes futile, attempt to escape any possibility of enslavement or re-enslavement. Despite my initial cynicism, Jean Itong and his story of a princely past life beckoned me, and I decided to do what no one had seemingly ever done in confronting this narrative. I decided to take Prince Itong at his word. I followed him back to his homeland on the Gulf of Guinea in current-day Benin, a place known to early modern European traders as the Slave Coast, and to the city of Ouida, named for his people's kingdom. Ouida was the principal commercial port of the region and was, from the 1670s to the 1860s, by far the leading point of embarkation for men, women, and children sold into chattel slavery on the Bight of Benin, and the second most trafficked slave port in the whole of Africa. We estimate that about 22% of all enslaved people exported into the triangular trade came from the Bight of Benin, and that 51% of these individuals were sold through the port of Ouida. In all, this means upward of 1 million people passed from their cities and villages through the horrors of the Middle Passage onto foreign shores, many from freedom into shackles. There's a strong chance that one of my own ancestors came to America on one of those boats. The kingdom of Ouida fell suddenly and violently in 1727 to its ally turned enemy, Dahomey, under the remarkable military forces of Dossou Agadja, the 5th king of Abomey, whose emblem you see here. I'm studying the life and death of Itong's father, King Afon, the last king of Ouida. My research has led me to the Fon people and languages, towards studying the religious, social, political, and military system of the Ouida people, and an upcoming trip to Benin, to do archaeological, art history, and ethnography work with the descendants of the Kingdom of Ouida. This will happen this spring when I am on sabbatical. Other part of my sabbatical, I will actually be in the UK at the University of St. Andrews with their visiting fellowship at the Center for French History and Culture. So I hope I'll make it down to see some of you in London at some point. So when the kingdom fell in 1727, many people of Ouida were gruesomely slaughtered and displayed. Some refugees escaped, and it's with these descendants that I am currently working. And many, many people were sold into chattel slavery. In this narrative, Jean Iton was one of the last surviving princes of the kingdom of Ouida, and this last prince most likely came into the French Empire as a slave. His humanity, like so many others, was overwritten by economic evaluation, and his life would have been worth only about 7 ounces of gold. When I introduced Iton at the start of my talk, I said that the archives made him visible, but that is something of an overstatement, as I'm sure Julie can also say about the subjects that she has studied. Jean Iton's life and claim to African royalty have been dismissed and even scoffed at by the tiny handful of scholars who have looked at Saxe's Black Regiment. Seen as an exotic aberration, Iton and his comrades were notable to scholars only for their Blackness, in contrast to, in the negative space of, the bastion of white male power that was the continental French army. The historical treatment of these men has been silently molded by the damaging and fallacious frame that Hegel put forth in his philosophy of history, one that posited, as Michelle Wright has written, the Negro stands outside analytical history, namely that history of intellectual, technological, moral, and cultural progress guided by absolute reason. The structural and cultural racism of the discipline of history, one that Haitian historian Michel Rolfe-Trouillot so poignantly interrogated in his seminal work, Silencing the Past, is undeniable. Grappling with this type of racism that solidifies in policies, practices, and attitudes, consciously or unconsciously, to the detriment of the study and livelihood of different non-white racialized peoples, is precisely the goal of critical legal studies and critical race theory. Within the context of our studies and the discriminatory structures that persist in our institutions and racialized culture, as well as mental processing, I assert the ineluctable need to study and develop critical race theory in our time, which is a major imperative of my current project. In this, I join a group of incredible scholars working to shine light onto African and African descended lives in the early modern era, engaging them, as Jessica Marie Johnson writes, in the overlapping diasporas they traversed, in order to tell a fuller history of freedom, Black humanity, and resistance to empire. Monumental research and theorizing by scholars working on Black women and predominantly Black women, with notable exceptions, conveys that Black radical feminist experience and praxis have been a driving force in scholarly innovation and bringing into focus the strategic erasures of the archives. In a political and ethical scholarly practice akin to the one delineated by Kimberlé Crenshaw in her original proposal of intersectionality and the figure of the Black woman so many years ago, we contend with Marisa Fuentes that, and I'm quoting Fuentes, enslaved women appear as historical subjects through the form and content of archival documents in the matter in which they lived, spectacularly violated, objectified, disposable, hypersexualized, and silenced. The violence is transferred from the enslaved bodies to the documents that count, condemn, assess, and evoke them, and we receive them in this condition, end quote. To my co-presenter, Julie Duprat's Marie-Thérèse Règne, who you will hear about shortly, to Jennifer Palmer's Dispossessed Mixed-Race Daughters of Planters, to Jennifer Morgan's Laboring Women Crammed into a Dehumanizing Culture of Numeracy, to Sadia Hartman's To Venuses, to Johnson's Black Women Swimming at the Crossroads Between Empires and Oceans, Diasporas and Archipelagos, I am introducing Prince Iton, his comrades, and 5 generations of Black men who traveled some of the same pathways, cultures, laws, and spectrum of freedom and servitude. Men, and in particular African and African descended men, have something of a dicey standing in the methodological turn of our moment. As post-colonial feminists have argued with righteous and rightful indignation, Black sisters have continually been rendered subaltern from the first wave of anti-colonial criticism to more modern instantiations of Black diasporic theorization, such as Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic. How is it that people speak of and uplift Aimé Césaire and France Fanon, but know nothing of Paulette and Jeanne Nardal, the mothers of Négritude and Black internationalism movements of which these men were a part? Why did it take us so long to realize and rectify the purposefully narrowing positioning of the male as the quintessential slave, revolutionary, and signifié of the word nègre, as Andrew Curran has shown? While it is indispensable to remedy these errors, my work on Black men in the 18th century French military has helped me to realize that they too have been spectacularly violated, objectified, disposable, hypersexualized, and silenced in ways that overlap and contrast with the experiences of Black women. Judging on the archives in which I work, to borrow Fuentes' formation, if we are cutting along the bias to include women, I argue that we actually need to cut along the bias to include men as well, and to work to exhume and rehumanize, recomplicate their identities and lives. In the vast silence, the work of talking Black allows them to talk back. That's the title of my talk. So at a time when critical race theory is under attack and scholars of the African diaspora are increasingly frustrated by the limitations of the predominant tropes for discussing Black subjectivity, it is more vital than ever to generate what Henry Louis Gates has called indigenous Black principles of criticism. In his piece entitled Talking Black, which my remarks today recast, Gates urged scholars to redefine theory itself from within our own Black cultures, and to at last don the empowering mask of Blackness, and to talk that talk, the language of Black difference. This theoretical imperative remains as pertinent today as it was in the 1980s when this piece was written, and it is urgent in the context of critical 18th century studies, which has for far too long as a discipline adhered to the exclusionary tenets of intellectual